Thanks for everyone joining us online and in person today. Very nice to have you. As Darlene mentioned, my name is Melanie Doyle. My pronouns are she and her. And I guess for the purposes of this presentation, my most relevant role may be as a per-course instructor in the Department of English. But I also work as an educational developer with CITL and am also a PhD student in the Faculty of Education. So I'm speaking today on social annotation to support undergraduate reading, and I guess I'm interested in reading from all of these roles and all of these angles. It's something kind of prominent in both my teaching and research, which is why I finally wanted to give this a shot last fall semester in fall 2023. So if you're joining us today, I presume you likely know a little bit about social annotation, maybe even just the bare minimum. But essentially, it's a process where students add comments, highlights, notes to texts for the purposes of information sharing, peer interaction, knowledge construction, as a collaborative means of making meaning from texts that typically they're assigned in their classes. That might be a novel, a textbook, journal articles, anything. It's all part of that annotation process. So, to put it as simply as possible, students mark up their assigned readings with one another. Reading is so often thought to be a solitary or sometimes even isolating process. The students I typically tend to teach in first year English classes know that they should be annotating. They know they should be marking up their assigned reading. But a lot of the times they don't. If they're reading printed material, they're doing it without a pen in their hand. Or if they're reading online, they're kind of scrolling through very quickly. So while they know that they should be doing this and they see others doing it, it's not something they always come into first year English 1090 doing on their own. So that's kind of one of my reasons for wanting to bring this into my class more explicitly. Social annotation, using online technologies turns this very ancient practice of marking up text into a collaborative exercise, where I hoped my students will be able to more thoughtfully and more actively engage with the assigned reading we were doing. And I had heard about this activity or this process for a few years now, on and off, mostly through, first year writing channels, composition rhetoric, venues, listservs, and so on. And I think it became a lot more popular, or people were willing to try it out over the pandemic. We were all reading online and we were missing that kind of in-class discussion people were used to having. So it's been kind of getting some, revitalized attention, I guess, so to speak. So that's kind of where I came at this from initially. But really there are a number of reasons why someone might want to try this. Maybe most obviously is to increase or hopefully promote reading compliance among students. Getting them to actually read the things we ask them to read can sometimes be a challenge. I know in my educational development role, it's a very common conversation with faculty. I assign these things and I don't think they read them. We try reading quizzes, we do all this stuff to try to promote it, but students often don't. So that is one reason people kind of turn to social annotation. And there is research to support that students are more likely to read their required material when it is tied to a grade in some means, particularly even if it's just participation. Another reason, we might be able to motivate students to read their work is through reading-writing connections, which I'll come back to later. So there is, a valid reason for trying social annotation as a means to get students to read. Another, kind of area of growing interest around this is to hopefully deter the use of generative AI, in reading and writing situations. And I'll admit that was, part of my interest in trying it. Again, I primarily teach English 1090 and 1110, so those are both designated critical reading and writing courses through the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science. So they're writing intensive. The main outcome of that is that we hope students will be more competent reading and writers. So it's a difficult thing to then have students turning to AI for all of that reading and writing. And though a lot of conversation around generative AI rightfully focuses on writing, there are also a lot of tools now that read for students, and I'm using the biggest scare quotes I can when I say that these tools read for students. because obviously they can't read, but they can try to summarize text for students, pull out the main points, or at least kind of give students the impression that maybe I don't have to read this work. So again, one of the reasons why I wanted to maybe try this was to offer a little more support around reading. So maybe my students felt confident enough or empowered enough, if I'm that naive to believe, that they wouldn't need to use AI to read their assigned reading. In that writing classroom, I really tried to scaffold as much as humanly possible so that every aspect of the writing process has all these built-in supports around it. So again, just another guardrail to hopefully kind of keep students on, what an authentic process of writing development might be for them personally, rather than turning to AI. But the third reason I have here, why I use AI, why I use social annotation, or why someone might use social annotation, is really the most important one to me, and that was to make reading more visible. And that was my main purpose. It's something I've always tried to do in my teaching, and this felt another way to make that visibility maybe most explicit. Both, and I say explicit, I guess, and I mean both for me as their instructor, but also for the students. I said earlier that reading is so often seen as a solitary experience. You don't know how other people read. It's something they kind of do on their own, and you come to class and they seem like they have all these great ideas or they produce good writing, but there's a lot that goes on behind those scenes that can seem elusive. So for students, I hope to make those processes a little more visible. For their own development, and again in that peer relationship as well. And for myself as their instructor, I want to support their reading, and that can be difficult to do sometimes when I don't know how they're reading. I don't see them reading. They do it at home a lot of the time, or they don't do it at all. So I hope the social annotation exercise, activity, assignment, whatever, would let me in on what goes on when they're engaging in those processes. Darlene mentioned at the beginning, I guess, that if anyone had questions, you can feel free to interrupt me. You can also wait to the end, but I have two small children, so I'm very used to being interrupted. I don't mind at all if you have a question or a comment before we get to the end, so feel free. So all of that was important to me, this making reading visible, in part because of the context in which I teach. So again, I teach in the English department, typically 1090, sometimes 1110. But this past fall, it was 1090. And again, those are CRW courses, which for anyone who might not know means critical reading and writing. They are offered by the faculty of HSS, but all undergraduate students are required to take at least 2 CRW courses. And they're the main mechanism we have at MUN to support students' reading and writing development. So they're a bit of a workhorse, and there's a lot of weight put on the role of reading and writing in these contexts. So the guidelines that we have around CRW courses tell us a little bit about what it should mean to teach reading in these environments. According to them, teaching critical reading encourages the development of the ability to analyze texts, arguments, including the identification of an argument and/or the way that evidence is used to support a thesis, and fosters increased awareness of the competence and the effective use of language. Teaching critical reading also involves helping students to read material closely and accurately. So there's a lot there, about what we're saying the values are, I guess, of reading at the university level. Closely, accurately, argument, competence. It's difficult to unpack, but there is a very clear stated value of explicitly teaching reading in this environment. And MUN isn't alone in requiring courses of this nature in its undergraduate program sequencing. It's a pretty, common model across North American institutions. But despite these models or these courses that universities offer to prioritize reading and writing, there's a lot of research that suggests, even in these environments, we still don't attend to reading instruction very explicitly. If we think of that critical reading and writing combo that we like to say, writing often gets the greater portion of attention in that combo. Maybe because it is the more visible product students produce writing. We don't typically see the reading students produce. So writing gets a lot of focus, and reading less so. Undergraduate students typically do not receive explicit instruction either in their general education requirements like CRW courses, or even within their discipline-specific majors. Once they're into their chosen major, no one is often explicitly teaching them how to read like a chemist or a historian. Though there's arguments we've made that we need that support. So why is that? We have these courses that are meant to teach critical reading and writing, and everyone's trying, but we don't always see that explicit instruction play out. I mean, there's a thought that reading is just so omnipresent. It's involved in everything we do at the university. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Is that a? Oh, okay. Someone was outside. Yeah, reading is so omnipresent in everything we do that we don't really need to attend to it explicitly. It's undergirding everything we do. Every piece of writing, everything we interact with, all the conversations we have, reading is so core at what it means to engage with knowledge at the university level. So why do we need to put it up on a pedestal? We're already doing it. There's also the, I guess, the problem of conflating teaching literature with teaching reading, or assigning reading and teaching reading. Again, I teach in the English department. We teach a lot of literature, and there are certainly reading strategies specific to understanding, comprehending, appreciating literature, but those are not often the same strategies needed to interact with sources in chemistry or understand a journal article from a psychology journal. So oftentimes when we, if we kind of reflect on our own teaching and we think, yeah, we do a lot with reading. We certainly teach reading in my course. Sometimes we guys conflate that between assigning reading and teaching reading, which is another reason, I guess, why reading often gets a little overlooked. So in light of that, I guess, social annotation was one way I hope to remedy this a little in my own practice. There's a lot of lamenting done around the way students come into university reading. And I get them typically in one of their very first classes. So I felt this was a good opportunity to kind of blow open some of their expectations around what reading is and what it might look like kind of going forward. So how did I do it? These were the instructions. Sorry if it's a little small. I wanted to fit them on one screen. Of what I presented to students, I think in week 2 of English 1090 last fall, around our social annotation activity. I think I called it collaborative reading annotations for the purposes of the course. So we kind of talked about it briefly in our first week, going over the syllabus, then really dove in week 2. So over the course of the semester, students were asked to complete 3 collaborative reading annotations in small groups, and each was worth, very small percentage, 2% of their overall grade. So we completed 1 for each unit of the course, so for 3 in total. I asked them, or I told them that the goal of this activity is to speak back to the text, but also speak back to one another. If I just wanted to see what they were writing, in the margins of their text, we could have done that as a solitary thing, they're passing it in to me and I return it. But I really wanted to see that collaborative aspect as well. They were encouraged to comment on the ideas in the text that stood out to them, any language, techniques, confusing moments, phrases, words, definitions, anything goes, I think was probably the wording I used in class. On that first day, I kind of modeled a short passage of how I would respond to it in the margins. And I think one of my annotations was just a series of 5 question marks. That was a very acceptable comment to make in this environment. We weren't aiming for perfection, but for developing, personalized reading and annotation strategies. So to receive full credit for each annotation, to get that full 2%, students were expected to engage with the text more than once during the unit. So again, we did 1 text per 1 unit for all 3 units. So they had a couple weeks basically to engage and comment, respond to their classmates, respond to their own earlier comments for each unit. So it was, meant to be an ongoing process. We don't read a text once, make an assessment of it, and then move on, never look back. Right? We continue to return to it, finesse our ideas, reconsider it under a new perspective or with new knowledge that we bring to it. We're informed by those around us and so on. So it being an ongoing process was kind of important to me and what I hoped students would take away from this assignment. Students were also expected to respond to their classmates, again, for that kind of peer collaborative component. If students asked questions or were confused by something, they were encouraged to comment, respond. Maybe you could answer that person's question. Further their ideas. Do a little bit more than just agree or disagree or say, that's interesting. What else could you say to your classmate to maybe complicate her idea or take it one step further? Students were also expected to do more than just highlight. I didn't discourage highlighting by any means. I think it's a super useful strategy when it comes to reading. But they were expected to also comment, paraphrase, make notes of some sort. Jot notes were fully acceptable, but they had to kind of speak back, type out something to get full credit. And they were also asked to demonstrate multiple readings and annotating strategies. I'll come back to this in a few moments, but we spend a lot of time in my English 1090 class naming, learning, and practicing different reading strategies for different reading contexts. So I wanted to see evidence that we were using those different strategies as we move through the semester. And I also reminded students that the notes that they were building in their margins with their group would be very useful to the writing assignments we were going to complete. We weren't just doing this off the side of our desk, something fun to do, but because it was a meaningful component of the writing that we were already engaged with. So that's what I did. But to return for a moment by that idea of making reading visible again, I guess I just want to expand on, again, what I hope to see. Not about the learning outcomes or what I hoped students would take away, but just like in my heart of hearts, what I really wanted students to learn from this. And that is that reading is an active and iterative process. I think there's a misconception with a lot of undergraduates that reading is a passive activity. They can do it while multitasking, and so sure, some can, but we don't just sit down with a book in front of us and like suck out the meaning like a very efficient vacuum. That would be awesome, but it's not how it works, right? We need to grapple and wrestle and work with that text over time, typically. So I hope students would get to experience that firsthand. I wanted them to see reading as a social and collaborative experience. While we might read alone, curled up with a blanket, we're always speaking back to those authors who wrote whatever we're reading, others who maybe commented on it, within some large intertextual network. So whether we see it or not, reading is very social. So I hope I'm making it explicitly social, and that they had to do it with a few classmates. That might, kind of spark that idea for them as well. And finally, I wanted them to see that there are many ways of reading. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to any text, to any situation, to any reader. Everyone will develop or should develop personalized reading strategies that work for them within the context in which they're reading. So I hope that by seeing how their classmates comment on these texts, what they choose to comment on, the strategies they use, whether they make jot notes or have fully formed sentences, or whether they abbreviate, all of that will reveal some of the different ways people might interact with the text. And for myself, I wanted to see how my students are reading. Too often we don't catch a misunderstanding or a gap in comprehension until students pass in some writing a couple weeks down the road. And at that point, I can try to backtrack and say, oh, I think we should revisit this idea. It seems, maybe there was some confusion. But once students kind of pass in that product, they kind of check out sometimes. And I feel like I've lost that opportunity to revisit what might have been a really formative reading moment. So by kind of offering up these social annotations, I hope to, insert myself in that process a little sooner. So if people were going astray or weren't, constructing meaning in the ways that were kind of, I think, building on all the ways they knew how at this point, maybe I could intervene with the whole group or on a one-on-one level if needed. I wanted to see what they were doing so I could better support it. So I guess we've been through the instructions of what I presented to students, but I think it's also worth acknowledging for me that this social annotation activity was not just bolted on to my course. There were a lot of other things happening that I think helped contribute to the success I had. I started this presentation by saying that I really value reading and explicit instruction of reading. So I was doing a lot of that already, which I want to, I guess, fill you in on. I also scaffolded the social annotation assignment into their writing process in a way that I think led to some, positive experiences. And for me, last fall, it was important to keep this whole activity very low tech, partially because I'm not very good at the tech things, and I sometimes hate making students make another account for something. So we're going to look at that too, what I use on the online side of things to make this happen. So yeah, reading is important to me, and I spend a lot of energy making it explicit in my teaching, especially in English 1090 when students are a lot of them are coming in out of high school and with varying experiences around this. So making reading explicit in my case often means that students are reading and writing about reading and writing. We read about new reading strategies, and then we write about those reading strategies, and then we use those reading strategies, and so on. Reading and writing are not just things we do for the purposes of understanding a poem, but they've become our subject of inquiry, really. It is our topic. It is what we're learning about. So that's kind of a guiding principle of this whole approach I have, I guess. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, we spent a lot of time learning specific reading strategies, a few of which I'll share here. This is by no means an exhaustive list of reading strategies undergraduates should be able to do, but they're ones that I found useful for a lot of undergraduates, especially in CRW courses, when I know a lot of them are going into very different disciplinary majors once they leave my classroom. So, for example, we learn how to annotate. I don't just ask them to do this social annotation exercise and send them on their way and say, fill your boots. We spend a lot of time talking about what annotating is, why we do it, and how we can do it, different ways to do it. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to that. We practice reading very literally. For what a text is saying, reading for content. That's an essential skill for a lot of students and will be useful in whatever discipline they choose. But we also talk about the limitations of reading for content, and that can only get you so far, and there are times when the situation in which you're reading will require something else. So we kind of discuss that. We practice close reading. It's kind of staple, I think, of most English departments. We practice reading like a writer, looking for the techniques or moves other authors make and considering when, as a writer, we might want to use those moves ourselves. It's super helpful for looking at new genres or new discourses. We play the believing, doubting game, to kind of practice critical thinking. When to approach a text kind of generously when you're looking for, when you're being a very generous reader, and when you're doubting, when you're being very hypercritical, when it's lying and you're trying to undermine it in some way. It's a great exercise. We dip into rhetorical reading, though it's, I guess, more of a focus in English 1110. But we look for parts of argument. What techniques is the author using to make their argument? What is their purpose? Who are their audience? And we complete double entry notes, to practice putting different texts, different authors in conversation with one another, and how and when to add our own voice to that conversation. So I share all this as the backdrop on which I tried social annotation. It's not to say, again, that these are the reading strategies everyone must teach, or to say that anyone who is interested in social annotation, must turn their course into a reading 101, so to speak. However, I do think it's helpful that, students have some sort of repertoire of reading strategies to draw on if you're going to assign some sort of activity like this. Because I think it's easy to assume that our students are very skilled readers sometimes, but when it is as invisible, as unvisible as it tends to be, that could be a dangerous assumption sometimes. And I also built the social annotations into the writing process. So I think everyone in person can see that well enough. Okay, here too. So this is just from the syllabus. But as you can see, the social annotation was part of the overall writing process grade, which is worth 20% of their overall grade. So it's worth as much as their biggest paper, more than their final portfolio. It's a huge portion of the course. And the reading and annotation itself had a comparable weight to their first drafts, to their peer reviews, to their reflections. It was important for me that students didn't see these annotations as just something extra that we were doing, but were a really integral part of the writing process itself. Our essays didn't start when we started drafting or when we skipped the draft and just passed in the final draft. They really started when we read those initial texts with with our peers. So that was an important piece for me. I'll also say that the reading and writing exercise kind of touched on those as well. A lot of the times we would use those reading and writing exercises to practice a new reading strategy, and then that strategy would kind of creep into the annotations. So it all kind of worked really well together, I found. And it was also, I guess I should say, a useful view into their work in relation to AI and those conversations. You know, again, rather than just seeing a final draft or even like a second draft and worrying whether students maybe did use generative AI tools to create a part of their text, you know, I was able to go back and say, well, how did they engage with their annotations? Did they have a lot of paraphrasing in their annotations? Were they, you know, I could kind of look at that process a bit earlier and hopefully trace the whole kind of textual history of a student's work, which was really useful too. And finally, low tech. Yeah, I'm not great at the technical side of things, and I really felt I didn't have the bandwidth to take on a new platform last September, though there are tools that are specifically designed for social annotation. Perusal and Hypothesis are probably the two most popular, and they both have their pros and cons. But in my class, I only use free open educational resources. And the textbook in particular I use for annotations has very generous Creative Commons licensing. So I kept things real simple and shared the readings in Google Drive. And given that one student's emails are all technically Gmail accounts, they were able to log in and access them and comment that way. So it worked really well for my purposes, but obviously if you are assigning a textbook or copyrighted information that is not shareable in these ways, that would not be an option. And I would recommend that you turn to one of these other platforms like Perusal or Hypothesis. I've since done a lot more digging into these and can probably answer some questions about them. I think I would use one of them in the future. Perusal is super robust and can spit out so much data about students' interaction with text that it was a little overwhelming, including like how much time a student, you know, was interacting with the text. It also does a lot of automatic grading, which I very particularly did not want. You know, I wanted to see what the students were commenting, so I didn't need it to, you know, grade it for me. Hypothesis is a little more bare bones, but it seems to invest a bit more in student privacy. So you kind of have to make that call for yourself, but both are pretty well used, and there's a lot of literature on both as well. So what did I learn, I guess, from all of this? I have a few slides here that are very kind of top view snapshots of some of the great things I saw last fall. They're a little limited because only a handful of students got back to me in time, giving me permission to use some of their comments. So you'll bear with me a little if there's some gaps. But I did see a lot of great things. So since we did one annotation for each unit, I saw that first unit as a real opportunity for me to model what I hoped students would be doing through this process, and to push any students who maybe needed a little more encouragement or direction. So I was super involved in the annotations for that first unit. You know, if a student was only highlighting, I could kind of say, like, that's great, but like maybe try other strategies so you can do other things. Or if a student highlighted something that I thought, you know, that student knows a lot more than she's letting on, like I'm gonna kind of give her a nudge to say a bit more here, I could do that. I could also comment on the strategies they were using. Again, so often we only see the output of students reading, you know, the summaries they pass in or the analysis they pass in. But this really kind of enlightened me to what strategies they were already using. Again, unit 1 with very little instruction at this point. So that bottom right there, you know, the student is saying, oh, this is one of the main topics, and she kind of summarized it briefly. So she's identifying, you know, the part of the text, the main point, that's, you know, useful to her if she's kind of skimming back through her notes later and looking for key pieces of information. So that labeling is a really great strategy that I was able to kind of commend her for. And then other students could see that and hopefully replicate it going forward. Students also responded to one another exactly as I hoped they would. I was like, yes, there was a win. So this conversation takes place over like 2 weeks, you know, towards late October to early November. And, you know, it's a conversation amongst students who didn't sit near one another, who didn't really talk to each other in class. But you can see the ways that they were able to build on one another's thoughts here. The first student, you know, kind of admits to not getting a key concept of a text we read that we'd already talked about in class. So, in my mind, I wondered, was she not willing to fess up in class to admit that she didn't quite get it yet, but felt comfortable here maybe to state that? I don't know. And then 3 other students respond to her. The first offers a very literal, I think, definition, nearly verbatim from what we talked about in class. A second student agrees, doesn't really say much more, but agrees, And then the third student chimes in and offers somewhat of a more nuanced perspective. They're kind of showing the ways these interpretations are building. We start with a very literal interpretation and then kind of complicate it a bit. And all in all, the student who asked the question seems to have a richer understanding 2 weeks later, all while we're talking about this in class and kind of still wrestling with it, which I really think demonstrates that iterative process I was going for. They're all unpacking the meaning of this text with one another. And I also saw students quite literally speak back to text in a way that, I just don't think we do often enough, or we don't see often enough if we're not kind of being forced to interact in such a public way. So, this was a comment on part of an essay where the author is asking, why would you want to start your essay with a quote? And the student answers the question. She says, well, I do it for this reason. And then another student responds to her with when he does it. And that I think that feeling that authority to answer the author's question is just such a beautiful moment that is lost if we don't kind of bring reading like this into our classroom in such a public way with one another. So it was really great that they kind of each had a different response and they could see a little more about each other's reading strategies, and again respond to the text in such an explicit way. But I was also able to see how different students approached the same passages. And not just, again, me seeing this, but they saw it for themselves. So these are two other comments, from that same passage of text. The student on the left paraphrased it. It was a couple paragraphs, and she kind of condensed that down in her own words, in a way that really captured the meaning in I think, a very thorough way. The student on the top right had a very simple statement, but she was looking at the techniques that the author was using. And then, of course, the students on the bottom right were making those text-to-self connections. So, from here, I can see that the students are using a lot of strategies. There's 3 right here on the one passage of text, and again, they can see these for themselves too. So they can see how their classmates are approaching these same passages of text with very different stances, looking for different meaning through different reading strategies. And students themselves were pretty overwhelmingly positive about the whole process of social annotation. I've tried a couple of different, funky things when it comes to reading in class, and this has been my most successful so far, I'll say. These were all comments that came from informal mid-semester and end-of-term feedback. We do a stop, start, continue activity just to kind of get a sense of how things are going. That's where I pulled these from. So students report, having to do the annotations helped me to describe what I was reading and better understand it, but also allowed me to see the ways other classmates understood the reading. This was a great addition to the course. Someone found that the group reading annotations contributed to the understanding of the essays assigned. And someone wrote that they thoroughly read and annotated multiple readings in order to fully understand the readings, which greatly helped me to complete the multiple writing assignments, so that reading-writing connection that I was going for. And these were 2 comments from CEQs at the end of the semester that I felt were also worth including. That latter when I'm already incorporating annotation skills that we've highlighted in English 1090 into my other courses. I mean, that's the goal really of 1090 and other CRW courses, is that transferability. We want the skills students are developing to be able to be carried forward into new contexts. And that top left one, I kind of just had a chuckle at it. I found the readings really manageable because they're not easy readings. They're dense, they're kind of difficult, and they're all long. They're all 20, 25 pages long, which for an undergraduate is giving them the Iliad. They all complain about it at first. Yeah. So I like to think that part of what made these manageable are breaking the reading process down a little more slowly and doing it with one another. Right? That's what I'm telling myself anyway. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. Maybe they're easier than I thought they were. Some other observations I had that I didn't really have, support for from samples for students that I was able to sample from. But the total number of comments increased each unit. So I kind of like backed off as we kind of moved through the semester. Again, I was like super involved in that first unit. The second unit less so, unless there was, cause. And the third unit, I don't think I made any comments, but the students' comments increased each time. So that I appreciated knowing that, they weren't only doing it because they felt I was super closely watching, or maybe they still knew I was closely watching. But they became very engaged in it, and I think became more confident in what they were doing as well. It became very easy to integrate the social annotations into the writing we were already doing. Again, a lot of students began trying to paraphrase in the margins, which I think is a useful strategy anyway, and something I encouraged them to do. And then I would find those paraphrases in their essay. So, when they were working on their drafts, they would go back to their annotations and pull the paraphrasing, pull the work they already did, and use that as a starting place, or at least, into the essay they were writing, which I think was a really productive approach. And I was also able to point them to the annotations when I was giving feedback on their drafts or even on their smaller exercises. If a student had a kind of underdeveloped point in their argument, but I knew that, they had said something really cool in their annotations, I could point them to go back there and say, hey, you commented this earlier, this fits in really well here, use it. So again, I was able to be a little more involved in, I think, supporting them to get where they needed to be. Some students seemed to rely less on highlighting as the semester went on. Students who did primarily highlighted in Unit 1 seemed more willing to comment on others' posts, on others' comments as the semester went on and write their own. And students often made annotations during our class discussions. So if we were talking about a reading for a period, I would see them on their laptops making annotations or marking up the text. And I thought it was great. Makes perfect sense. Of course, it's what you do. But I realized after a few of them were trying to hide it. I don't know if they thought they were cheating or something. But if we're talking about the text and you have an idea or you hear a good idea, of course you write that down. That's the whole thing. So they picked up on that on their own. But I thought it was funny that they thought they shouldn't be doing that or that I shouldn't know. So concluding thoughts. I guess I do hope to do this again in a future semester. I think the process gave me a lot of insight into how my students read and allowed me to support them in new ways. I said that I've tried a couple other things when it comes to reading. One I've liked the most is a reading log where they're writing not about the content, but how they're reading. It's more of a reflection piece on the strategies they use. And I've loved that, but students have hated it. They don't like doing it. But this has been much more positive from the student perspective, it seems. But more than anything, I think it was able to create a much more authentic and also maybe less AI-able environment to collaboratively engage with reading than something like a discussion board post, which I think we have always turned to a lot of the time, especially for teaching online. Which does give you some of that social interaction of responding to one another about a text. But it's not very organic, right? Students don't talk that way in conversation, whereas the comments that I was able to capture in the annotations did reflect a more, I think, natural tone of voice that they were, communicating with one another. And it also allowed me to, I guess, see and comment on and support student reading processes rather than just evaluate the written output. I wasn't just assigning and assessing a summary or a critical analysis. We did that, but we also looked at the process and the strategies and what got them there. So, if someone submitted a summary and didn't do very well, I could kind of go back to the annotations and see, well, how are they reading? Maybe there's something we can do here to kind of get you to where you need to be, rather than just giving them a bad mark on the summary and moving on without addressing that kind of the root of that problem. So in the future, I hope, I guess, to better integrate it into class. We did that a little bit, but it was, there's never enough class time for everything. But I do hope to find ways to make it more of a class activity as well as a take-home activity, given that students were already keen to do it in the classroom. That might mean spending, the first 2 minutes of class time scanning through your group's annotation, see if there are any new comments that are worth kind of bringing up in class discussion, something of that nature. Reminding students that they can obviously complete these during class time. And I think I would also like to look into a third-party tool maybe to try that out in a future semester. So it kind of opens up my text selection, perhaps. So those are, I guess, my next steps. But overall, it was a really wonderful opportunity to, I guess, be invited, or maybe to forcibly insert myself in students' reading processes. But I learned a lot about their reading, and I think I was able to support them in new ways. So that's all for me. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Or read them if you prefer to put them in the chat. I have no special talent, so I cannot perform anything beyond what I've just done. Okay. Well, if there aren't any questions or comments.
Question, I guess, yeah. Give me a second. So here is a question by Sean Doyle, and I'm reading it loud. In a course that is not specifically targeting reading or writing, in example, a biology course, what are some of the challenges you think might arise, and how do you think that they could be addressed?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I guess I have a couple answers to that. My own personal philosophy is that I think any course should be maybe a reading and writing course to some extent, right? Because there are so many discipline-specific ways of reading and writing that students are, struggle to grasp sometimes without that explicit instruction. So I guess my biggest thing is that, what opportunities can we have? And I know it's a challenge within, program sequencing and content that you have to cover. But where, when possible, can we make reading and writing more explicit across the curriculum in every discipline? That's always my kind of number one goal. But challenges that you might face in a biology course that doesn't have a mandate to attend to reading and writing, like say a CRW course. I think reading compliance is a big one. I hear from faculty and instructors that students don't read a lot of the textbook they're assigned to do, that they're assigned, and they come to lecture unprepared then without the requisite background knowledge and so on and so forth. Social annotation can be great, and there's literature to support it in that case. Perusal and I think Hypothesis as well both have pretty huge repositories and connections with libraries. So a lot of discipline-specific textbooks that are in common rotation are able to be integrated with those platforms. So you might make a small group. So if you're all have to read chapter 1, you also have to do these annotations. So at the very least, they're getting some practice using different strategies and making annotations in a way that might be useful for a future biologist.
There is a comment, not a question, and I'm reading that by Kelvin. Very informative. You have given me some ideas for experimentation in my future classes. I was not aware of these collaborative annotation applications.
Thanks, Kelvin. Yeah, I hope so. We can chat more about it if you like. I haven't tried either of these. I did go to a demo on Perusal, and I learned a lot from it. It's very robust in what it's able to do. And again, for my own purposes, I didn't want a lot of those features. I don't care how long they spent on a text. I didn't need, to quantify their comments. I didn't want the automatic grading. But so for certain cases, and especially in a large class, it could be really useful.
And there is a comment by Nadine Adams. I'm reading that. Thank you, Melanie, for bringing annotations to light. I used this strategy in my past ESL classes. It was mind-blowing for many of my students how much they gained from the strategy. I always refer to this strategy as reading with your pen. It is so important to highlight the critical reading process as a bridge to critical writing. In the past, I used a variety of disciplines to provide practice to read with your pen.
Thanks, Nadine. Yeah, it's a really great point. So this class in particular was a mix of students from different backgrounds with speakers of different languages. But I did see a couple articles specifically about using social annotation for students for whom English is an additional language that you might be interested in as well. But the comment of reading with a pen, I'm glad you kind of mentioned that more explicitly, because that was kind of my main reason actually for only doing this for one reading a unit. You know, we read more things each unit, but I only require this for one reading because personally, I'm so married to paper still. And I just couldn't bear forcing the students to only read online. I know that most of them do it anyway, and very few of them ever came with paper. But I mean, I still like reading with paper and with a pen. And I mean, there's a bit of literature to support that that's a more, you know, a better way to read in some cases, will lead to kind of better comprehension and retention. So I'm glad you brought up that pen, because I that was one thing I lacked throughout this process, I guess, was that kind of tactile experience in some way, and worrying that I was taking that away from students. Cool, folks. I guess if there's nothing else, my email's there if you want to chat more about reading or writing, or anything else, especially in the disciplines. I love reading and writing in the disciplines. And yeah, thanks for coming.